Very special thanks to Philip Raby Specialist Cars in Emsworth, Hampshire for providing the vehicle in this review. They're a Porsche Centre by trade, but with some other pretty nice cars in there as well, some Astons, some Mercs such as this one, and it's always nice to work with the dealer who not only sell vehicles and service them, either speciality or otherwise, but who clearly love the cars that they work with. True petrol heads, so if you are in the UK and you're looking for a vehicle such as the ones that they have in stock, or if you already own a Porsche and are looking for servicing, then click the link down in the description and check them out. For this particular review, I'm going to go ahead and do something that I wouldn't typically do, and that is reverse the order of what I'm going to say. So instead of starting off with the specs and, what kind of expectations you had about the car, and then working toward a final verdict, which is how most journalists do it, I'm going to go ahead and tell you straight off the bat that I love this car. And although that might encourage you to not stick around for the whole video, I'm going to go ahead and trust that those of you who are, for instance, in the market for something like this will want to hear more than just that, because of course I'm going to get into some of the reasons why. Now, to be honest, the single biggest reason why I like this car so much is the classic case of expectations versus reality. It's always nice to go into a car review and come out of it with a completely different mindset. Sometimes you don't know what to expect and get pleasantly surprised. Sometimes you think you do know what to expect and you're still surprised. To me, that was the case here, because I've driven a couple of very different AMGs to this on the channel recently. The C32 AMG, for instance, completely different animal to this car. The ML55 SUV, which despite having a very similar engine spec, essentially the same engine, but in a different state of tune, but again, a totally different animal to work with. Taller, heavier, much more space, completely different performance. This one though, more than those that I've reviewed so far, really hit the nail on the head as far as what I want and what I expect from a Mercedes AMG. This gives you everything you think of Mercedes for. It's big, it's understated, it's boxy, it's supremely comfortable, one of the smoothest cars I've ever driven. It's in incredible condition because it's been so well loved, and the performance is fantastic. In fact, this is one of my favourite vehicles that I've reviewed so far on the channel. Now, no vehicle is, let's say, objectively perfect. There's pretty much something you can always change and tweak or complain about if you want to. On this occasion, let's get to those two things first, because there are some potential drawbacks to the ownership experience of an AMG. Let's say, for example, you want to buy one and use it every day. As many of my reviews are catered to that kind of buyer, let's get into that. So what are the drawbacks? Well, the first one is fairly obvious, so we'll get to that second. The main thing about this particular generation of E-Class, not just the AMG but the regular ones as well, is they are somewhat susceptible to rust. And that's more of something to look out for rather than to be scared of. For instance, you can tell that fairly easily when you're looking at the car. You don't need to own it for any amount of time to suddenly realise that it has rust. This one, for instance, doesn't have any issues in that regard. It's probably one of the best, if not the best, E55 out there. It's mint, borderline show car condition in fact. But that is something to bear in mind, so if you're looking for an E-Class, in fact you could say looking for any car really, but in particular these, make sure that you give the car a good look around underneath, under the bonnet, in the door wells for instance. Just check around for that rust. If it's not too bad, of course you can get it dealt with, but it is something to watch out for. Secondly, the more obvious thing is, especially when it comes to the AMG, it's a pretty thirsty car. Now, I said that that's an obvious thing because it is obvious, and with most performance cars, that tends to be the biggest drawback. Certainly one that you notice every day more than anything else, it does like to drink. However, in my time driving this car, the fuel gauge actually barely moved, and even though of course I wasn't doing autobahn speeds all the time, it was still kind of reassuring to see such a large, relatively heavy and certainly powerful and torquey car that doesn't just drink like an alcoholic all the time. That was nice to experience. So speaking of that power and performance, how quick is this thing? because there are so many different AMGs, starting from these far more mainstream ones that didn't necessarily have the direct race influence that AMG started with in the 90s, then of course through the Daimler Chrysler era, and now out the other side of that with Mercedes AMG being kind of its own sub-brand almost of the Benz empire. So, what is the performance on this one? Well, as I said earlier on, it shares the same essential engine as the ML55, which I reviewed, 5.4 litre V8, curiously though, not supercharged. This is not a compressor model, it's naturally aspirated. I personally love that. Of course, the extra power is always nice, but trust me, this car does not need more power. And that's a crazy thing to say for an AMG, kind of sacrilegious I guess, but to me this has a perfect spec. And the reason why I would say that actually directly correlates to my last car. And I bring it up a few times on the channel because it actually compares pretty well to a lot of the vehicles that I look at. And that is of course the earlier 2005 shape Maserati Quattroporte. Because, in a funny kind of way, if you're in the market for something like an E55, that is probably also on your shortlist, at least for some people. It's a similar price, similar size, similar kind of category, and even the performance is fairly close. But that's my point. If you look at the spec of the Maserati, well, it's a far more powerful car. Around 400 horsepower, this car is 350. And yet, the Mercedes is at least as fast as the Maserati. From 0 to 60. Now top speed wise it may not be because of the limiter of course, 155 miles an hour, but you could always get that removed if you wanted to. The point is that 0 to 60 time of about 5.4 seconds is very impressive for a car with 350 horsepower. And if you're wondering how they managed to do that, well there are actually two reasons. One is the weight and the second is the torque. Torque is something which a lot of people talk about, but don't really understand. Torque is just twisting power, but the actual reality of what torque does for a car means so much more than that. Torque is what allows you to just effortlessly glide out of a corner and leave everything in the dust. It's what allows you to, from a low speed, pull out into traffic, waft past everything in your way, and overtake with ease. That is what torque is all about. Plus, although people don't often think of it, torque is actually good for fuel economy because it means that the engine has a huge amount of strength in effect without needing to work that hard. And that is the key advantage that this has over that Maserati's Ferrari engine. It's not torquey. It's got 400 horses, but not much more than 300 pound-feet. This, on the other hand, with 350 horsepower, has almost 400 pound-feet. That is a lot of torque for this naturally aspirated engine to have. Now of course, the later AMGs with that compressor or supercharger layout do have even more, but this is the one that we're focusing on for now. The second thing that I mentioned though is the weight. This is no way near as heavy as you'd probably expect it to be. You think Mercedes AMG from the 90s or otherwise, if it has 4 doors, chances are it weighs 2 tons. At least that's the general rule of thumb that I would assume. I mean, even a Mercedes SL convertible with only 2 seats can weigh over 2 tons in its AMG form. So can the CL, of course the ML can. So surely this one does too. Actually it doesn't. It weighs a lot less than you'd think, around 1700 kilos. In fact, according to the test results that I found, one of the heaviest ever put into the press was about 1800 kilos verified. That's about 4,000 pounds for our American friends. A 1.8 metric ton car at the worst, more like 1.7 in practice. That is a lot lighter than 2 tons. Those 300 kilos mean that instead of being the weight of a Quattroporte, because that is a 2-ton car, this is actually closer to the weight of the Maserati 4200 GT Coupe, which I reviewed last time. I would have never guessed that a large, luxurious, big V8 engine Merc would be that light, but the performance tells you that it is, and boy can you feel it, because this is actually one of the most fun AMGs I've driven as well. It's so different to the C32. The C32 has a much more youthful, playful, almost hot hatch style vibe, the way it just throws itself through corners. This is totally different. This is just sheer presence and power on the road. I thoroughly enjoyed driving this car. And to get to some of the stuff which I always like to discuss, such as the practicality and the driving feel and the space, well, as you can see from some of the camera shots, it certainly isn't lacking for space. In fact, this is one of the most comfortable experiences I've ever had in a car. The headroom is endless, the width and legroom is fantastic, The seat adjustment is perfect. Everything about it is pretty great for a larger guy, so of course it will be for a smaller person as well. Just push the seat forward, job done. The trunk space is great. The rear passenger legroom, of course, it's an E-Class, so it's good. And for those of you who are potentially thinking about using this as a daily driver, don't worry, there's a wagon as well. And although that one's pretty rare, I must admit that is a very enticing car. This is one of those relatively few reviews where I could see myself actually buying one of these, and that's kind of a high endorsement for me. The wagon version, although rare, gives you so much more trunk space. So for instance, if you're in the market for an AMG that you can use every day, I would strongly recommend that you check out the E55. Now in particular, of course, this is the W210 generation, and there was a facelift slightly later on. I must admit I'm not a fan of that facelift. Of course the W211 came much later on, but from this boxier 90s to 2002 shape, the facelift, as I said, I'm just not a fan of, although you do tend to see slightly more wagons in that facelifted form if that's what you're going to go for. Speaking of finding these though, it actually shouldn't be too difficult depending on where you live, because this one isn't crazy expensive. It's in fantastic condition. You can even look on the website down below, as I said, and check out some of the detailed shots. This is about £12,000–13,000. That's pretty great for the amount of car that you get. As I said, a similar kind of price range to a good condition Quattroporte or some other rivals as well, 2-door and 4-door alike. And if you get one that's maybe not quite as mint as this, but still passable, well, you could probably knock maybe 4 or 5 grand off of that price quite easily. Now, a couple of the other things that I want to discuss in this review are actually pertaining to its mechanicals once again, the gearbox and then the suspension. First of all, the gearbox in this one is of course an auto. I kind of love the way that Mercedes lays out their automatic gearboxes though. It gives it kind of this semi-auto vibe, the way you clunk the shifter into these different patterns instead of just clicking it forward and back as usual. But that's a personal thing, some people probably wouldn't care. In terms of how the gearbox operates though, that is what I wanted to discuss, because it's a 5-speed, not unheard of for an AMG of course, but it is silky smooth. And for a gearbox, especially an auto, that's over 20 years old, regardless of mileage, to still feel that unnoticeable. That's my key point. To me, that impresses me. A great gearbox is one that you don't notice the car changing gear in. That is the case here. And that also ties into my thoughts on the suspension. Now, I believe that the suspension on this car may be a point in which some people who drive it don't agree with what I say about it, because the suspension in this car has a wonderful feeling, to me at least, where it almost feels like an adaptive damping system. Because at lower speeds, it feels exactly like you'd expect a Mercedes to, like you're floating along in a V8 powered cloud. In the best ways. It doesn't wallow around too much like some 50s Cadillac. It's perfect, it's comfortable, it's planted, it's great. However, when you put your foot down and start to take some corners at higher speeds, it gets a lot stiffer. The car handles its weight very well, what weight it does have, and despite the fact that it is pretty large, it's certainly more of a boxy area than something like a Quattroporte, it actually gets much more focused than you'd expect. And it's at that crucial point where I believe some people's opinion of the suspension might differ from mine. I love it. I think that it's fantastic that the car's personality kind of totally changes on a dime depending on if you're driving it sedately or rapidly. I believe some people, though, may complain that it's a little bit too hard under heavy performance. That is understandable. I would get that opinion, even though I don't agree with it. Because to me, the last thing you want from a large 1.7, 1.8 ton car is for it to still be soft when you're putting your foot down. You need it to be more focused for corners, and to me, again, for a 20, 21-year-old car, it holds up remarkably well. This is definitely one of my favourite AMG experiences that I've had, and the single biggest thing that makes me love the car so much is that it actually delivers exactly what you expect an AMG to be like. It's understated, it's big, it's spacious, effortless power, even more effortless torque. It sounds lovely. When revving up the car, it doesn't sound that dramatic. It's when you're actually driving it where it sounds great. And in particular, I love that it sounds great at low speeds. It has that lovely gurgle sound which you want from a V8, and it's actually one of the more audible V8s of the cars that I've driven so far. Overall then, my verdict is that this is 100% an AMG that you could for sure use every day. The only choice that you need to make really is, if you are dead set on using an AMG every day, which one do you go for? Something like an E55 wagon, which is massive and powerful and spacious, or do you choose something that's a little bit more compact, a little bit more affordable, and a little bit more nimble through corners, such as the C32 AMG that I looked at? To me, the choice, in my opinion, is clear. I would most definitely go for the E55 for all of the reasons that I mentioned. It's just more of a quote-unquote proper big Mercedes. The C-Class, though, is something which I would also recommend looking into. Check out my review for that one as well. It's a very different animal, but also delivers a lot of that AMG experience. But that's it overall for my thoughts on the W210 generation E55 AMG. Of course, if you're new to the channel, be sure to click here on screen to check out my other reviews, including those other Mercedes models that I mentioned. And until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.